1 minute and 3 minutes.
Okay. So when you do that, is that you're not that you're angry with what I'm saying, but that I need to finish. Okay. Well, I want to start by thanking Wayne for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here and to express my gratitude for this occasion. I'm also not a museum expert and museum person. I'm much more working on decolonial thinking, and this is what I'm bringing to the table today. So what does decolonial thinking can bring to the reflections you are having about the role of the museum today? So because I know, as I am not a person from the museum, I know you are not persons from the decolonial network of artists, thinkers, and so what I will do is to explain very briefly some of the key standpoints of decolonial thought so that we can have a vocabulary for our conversation. With the question of, I will make a little preamble, the question of global citizenship or world citizenship has something to do indeed with connected histories, with the discovery of connected histories instead of national histories, with the overcoming of what we call in sociology methodological nationalism, and going towards what Gurminder Bambara has called connected histories. Now, when we open connected histories, there is something at stake, and is that when we discover our connected histories, we open a field that is not even, a field where there is a lot of power differentials that are configured by what we call the colonial difference. So opening the question of connected histories doesn't bring us into a happy picture of multiculturalism, but bring us into the question of how to address, on the one hand, the colonial wounds that are still open, and on the other hand, the ignorance of privilege, of eurocentrism. So this is how I will lead my talk today. I will first say how we understand the world today from the decolonial perspective. The decolonial is not decolonization. I need to clarify this from the beginning because you are in museum studies and decolonization is a common word, but the decolonial is different from decolonization. Decolonization is a historical political process that happened in different stages in history, whereas the decolonial is a position to, let's say from this perspective, to think and act critically against or to overcome the modern colonial order. And today we say we still live in a modern colonial order. Not because colonialism is still active, well in some parts it is, but because coloniality is still ongoing. So issues of racism in our societies, for example, are a clear mark that coloniality is ongoing, and that this coloniality has pursued its power through many different areas of life, aesthetics, through epistemology. The way we know is still very colonial. We just conducted a research in the University of Amsterdam about diversity and about how to decolonize the university, how to transform our systems of knowledge, to move them away from that monocultural perspective, Western perspective, into a real pluriversality, as we say. So when we speak of modernity, coloniality, we are saying something very simple. We are saying we cannot speak of modernity without coloniality. This is the work of many of the authors of our school, if we can call it a school. And we say then that the history of progress and civilization that is associated with modernity cannot be separated from the history of violence, of destitution, of denigration, of exploitation, of extraction from the earth. So we place the beginning of modernity not in the Industrial Revolution or the Reformation or the Enlightenment, but we place the beginning of modernity in 1492 with the colonial encounter, with the beginning of the colonial expansion of Europe. Because, as Enrique Dussel says, it is the moment in which Europe begins to define itself as the center of the world. Before the colonial encounter, without colonies, Europe cannot think of itself as the center of the world. It was one province in a multicultural world or pluricultural world. So that's why we connect very intimately the issue of modernity, that we use the term to name the project of Western civilization, to a process of coloniality. So there is no project of Western civilization. There is no possibility of Europe thinking itself at the center of world geography. If you were educated in the West or in any colonial territory, you have in your mind the world map that is Eurocentric, that has Europe at the center. That has nothing to do when you take a picture of the Earth from space. Europe will not appear at the center, right? So that map we have in our imaginary is one of the moments, or is a metaphor that can help us see the power of knowledge configuring our worldview. And this is where the museum, the ethnographic museum, has played a central role in this articulation between modernity and coloniality, in this articulation of the system of representation that will consolidate Europe as the center of the world, as the center of world geography, and very importantly, as the now of history. So Europe will define itself as center of geography, like in this world map, but also as the now of history, as the present of history. Every other society in the world will be relegated to the past of Europe. And this is what I call temporal discrimination. So how the peoples of the world were placed in the margins of geography and in the past of history. And this operation was being performed by the ethnographic museums. Obviously, because this is the city of Siebold, and he wrote this very famous letter on the uses of the ethnographic museum, I think in a few centuries ago, before there were any real ethnographic museum, he wrote this letter. And he clearly explained that the ethnographic museum will be a necessary condition for colonial success. So the museum was, from the beginning, part of the colonial enterprise. And I think the effort we are doing here, and you've been doing, of thinking the role of the ethnographic museum is a privileged site of thinking this articulation between modernity, coloniality. So how the museum configured at the same time modernity and coloniality. So I will go to speak about what is the difference between modernity and coloniality. So we say there is no modernity without coloniality, there is no progress without the violence of coloniality. But they speak of very specific movements. And modernity speaks of the movement of appropriation, like the appropriation of lands, like the biggest appropriation of land in history is the colonization of what the Europeans call the Americas, what we call in our texts Abya Yala. But also the appropriation of life. So it is the appropriation of the materiality of the world, if you want to speak like that. So modernity is about that system of appropriation that is coupled with representation, with a system of representation. So modernity will control the appropriation of the world through trade, through geography, through political colonization, through the plantation economy, appropriating lives and territories. It will couple it with a system of representation. It will control the narration of the world and of world history. So this system of representation will have the task to legitimize the ongoing appropriation of the world. And here you see already this at play in the collections of the ethnographic museums, how they were performing this appropriation of the cultural goods of humanity and controlling the narration of those goods. So incorporating them into what I call the epistemic territory of modernity. So by an act of translation as erasure. So by removing the thing from its communal, ancestral, earth relation and placing it in the narrative of science, in the system of classification. That was incidentally also happening with people, right? The human zoos across Europe were performing this, placing others into the categories of colonialism. Okay, so modernity, movement of appropriation and representation. So the control of the appearance of the world and the control of the materiality of the world. Now, coloniality is designating a different movement. And the movement of coloniality is speaking about the erasure, is speaking about the violence that was necessary for the institutionalization or the establishment of the modern order. So when we ask the question of modernity, we ask the question of what is there? And most of our sciences are designed to reply to this question. The question of what is in presence, the representation of the real. But the question of coloniality is different, and it is about what has been lost, what has been erased. And it is this question that I think the museums that you are associated with could begin to address. When I hear the Vienna Museum is starting an exhibition on colonialism, I think the museum can play a very important role, not to reinforce the narrative of modernity, that is what it has been doing, but to undo the double erasure of coloniality. Double erasure because first it was the erasure of other cultures and of other ways of being in the world, of the human diversity of the world. But not only that erasure happened, we also erased from our narrative of modernity that erasure happened. So modernity will become an intra-European narrative that excludes colonialism, or colonialism will be, if at all, narrated as an aberration of modernity and not as a constitutive moment of modernity. So the question of what has been lost, or the struggle against oblivion, that is one of the key struggles today across the social movements in the global south, or the or of native or originary populations. They are struggling against oblivion to regain dignity, to enter this world citizenship. So, let me see how much time I have. I still have like 5 minutes. Okay. There is a lot more to discuss, But so one of the issues of this relation between modernity and coloniality is how can we achieve a decolonial stage, some stage in which we overcome the modernity coloniality system. And one of the things here that becomes important in my own thinking is to overcome what we call the arrogant ignorance of Eurocentrism. So how can the museum that has played such an important role reinforcing Eurocentrism can help us overcome that form of ignorance? Because Eurocentrism has been a form of ignorance of all the other knowledges of the world, of the epistemic diversity of the world, as Santos says. So how can we overcome the arrogant ignorance of Eurocentrism? And I think what is very important as well is that the museum, like the ethnographic museum, has not just been playing a role representing the other as the other, but this representation of the other has been essential for the formation of the self, of the European self. Because the European self was constituted in the colonial relation to alterity. So without the negation of the other as equal, as human, as in the present, there's a long history of this, the self of the citizen is not existent. So I think the museum has to address the question of whiteness, the question of how this citizenship was produced precisely through the negation of the other. So the publics of these museums in late 19th century, early 20th century, as the publics of the international exhibitions with the human zoos, were not just learning about the other, they were constituting themselves as the subjects of modernity, as the beings in the present and in the center of world history, of geography. So I think this is a key topic that needs to be addressed. So how these collections and this form of exhibition has performed a task to produce whiteness and has been complicit with this arrogant ignorance of Eurocentrism, producing an ignorance of the larger epistemic diversity of the world. So let me just close with, there are many things to say. So on the question of unlearning the ignorance of Eurocentrism, to really enter a consciousness of connected histories where there is power differentials, to uncover the history of coloniality, to begin allowing, I think, to overcome this ignorance means also that the museum could allow the European publics to begin hearing the vision of the other philosophies of the world about Europe. So how the other worlds have been thinking, because thinking is not exclusive to European genealogy, from Plato to Deleuze, right? There is philosophies in every society. And every society has been affected by this model of modernity coloniality. How they have been thinking us or Europe. And then how much can the European citizen learn? How much can the European citizen learn? Instead of only learning through its own internal narrative of modernity, which is obviously a type of ignorance, as I was saying, how much can we learn from learning how the world has thought about modernity, about the West? And then possibly we can reach a consciousness of our location in history, not as a default position, not as the unmarked position as feminism has shown, but as a position that is very clearly one of the constitution of eurocentrism, of whiteness, the unspoken position. I think these museums have the possibility through their collections to begin talking about the construction of this whiteness, so that this whiteness becomes conscious of its own history and how it is implicated in the world divisions of today. Thank you.